Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today is going to be a little bit different of an episode here in which I'm going to cover 12 takeaways or 12 tips from my previous 12 podcast guests here. So number one is going to be from Dr. Melissa Davis. And this was my very last podcast I published here. And in this podcast, we talk about habit building. And if you're anything like me, you kind of hear someone talk about habit building and it's like immediately, or I at least anyways, kind of lose interest. It's like something about it is just kind of less sexy compared to other topics. But I would say that in my experience over the last several years now of coaching, rarely does a client, or rarely, not even one of my clients, when it comes to people asking me about fitness advice, whether it's friends or family and stuff like that, rarely is it someone doesn't really know what they should do. Like most people understand that they should probably, eat a bit less junk food. They should probably work out more regularly, but they just can't seem to stick to these goals and stick to these habits. And I think that when framing things like this, it makes learning about habit building and stuff like that a bit more important. So one kind of core takeaway from this episode is that people often set the wrong goals, in which beginners, they should probably be focused on setting more kind of learning goals and less specific goals compared to someone that is more advanced. And someone that's more advanced, they should probably be setting, maybe leaning towards a bit more kind of outcome goals and a little bit more specific goals. So an example of this in kind of the fitness space is that a beginner, they probably shouldn't set like a specific goal of, or a specific outcome goal of losing 5 pounds in 2 weeks. That's like a specific outcome goal. Rather, it might be better for them to focus on setting more of a learning goal. So a straight beginner, maybe they should first learn about the different macronutrients, about protein, about how much protein they should be eating per day, energy balance, kind of stuff like that. And then once they kind of learn about general nutrition principles, then they might be able to dial in a more specific goal from there. But if they just try to crash diet into losing 5 pounds in 2 weeks, that's probably not going to be a good long-term outcome for them. And then to the specificity aspect, they should probably focus on something maybe a bit more kind of a general. So they might say, over the course of the next year, I might want to generally lose some weight rather than a certain number of pounds and something like that. As when you first start working out and stuff, there's a very good chance that your weight might not even change, but you'll look better and get closer to kind of your fitness goals. And this is also why, kind of that learning goal of learning more about nutrition and fitness might help, because you might actually realize that weight loss on the scale might not always reflect the improvements in body composition that are going on. And then for someone more advanced, like for someone like me who has a master's in exercise science and has been coaching for several years and has been lifting since I was in middle school, so a decade at least, I might want to set more of a kind of specific outcome goal. Whereas for me, I could definitely set, over the next 10 weeks, I want to lose 15 pounds. That is like a specific outcome goal that I'm shooting for. And for me, I think that would be very appropriate to do. So a beginner focusing on more learning and behavior goals and less specific goals, more general goals. And then for someone more advanced, more specific, and even focusing on some of those outcome goals, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be setting kind of learning and behavior goals as well, as behavioral goals or changes of behavior is what leads to the outcome you're shooting for. But those are some kind of general takeaways there. And then also, kind of as a bonus here, we talked about habit chaining and kind of breaking the stimulus for preventing poor behavior. So habit chaining, if you already brush your teeth every single night, but you want to start incorporating like meditation or eating some more protein, maybe every night after you brush your teeth, I was going to say drink a protein shake, but that definitely doesn't work well in this situation. So you probably don't want to do that after you brush your teeth. But let's go with meditation. Every night after you brush your teeth, maybe you want to start meditating for 10 minutes. and you use that cue of brushing your teeth and you follow that up with a response of meditating for 10 minutes. And I think that that can definitely help kind of build these habits, as habits are usually stimulus response. So you're already kind of using that already built stimulus and you're just kind of adjusting that response there a little bit. And then also kind of breaking the stimulus to break bad habits. Like, let's say that, every time that you have a cup of coffee, you want to follow that up with a piece of chocolate or something like that. Well, maybe that's a habit that you want to break. And if so, just creating a break in that stimulus to response can be really helpful. So instead of immediately going for that chocolate, maybe you just say, hey, I'm going to give myself 10 minutes here. If I still want that chocolate, I'm going to go eat it. But I think often you'll find that once you give some time to fill in that space and you kind of break that stimulus to response cycle a little bit, you'll find that you're better able to kind of just say, hey, I actually don't need that chocolate. It's not aligned with my goals right now. 2 podcasts ago, I had on Martin Ruffalo and we talked about training to failure. And one important takeaway here is that training to failure depends on context. And it's not this like yes or no thing or an all or nothing thing in which all of your sets are to failure or none of your sets are to failure. And important considerations are like how many days per week you train, how much training volume you're doing, how frequently you're hitting a muscle group, and all of these different things. So, for example, I have clients that train like 2 or 3 days a week and they just have a lot of stuff going on. Maybe they also train martial arts and they're just trying to balance everything. Well, for them, I'm not really worried about the fatigue from our training that much. Like if you're training 2 or 3 days a week, it's unlikely that you're going to find yourself in like an overreached, overtrained state. So in those situations, I'm okay with kind of pushing a little bit closer to failure more often because I'm not necessarily worried about the overall fatigue from their general program running them into the ground. But if someone's training 6 days a week and they're really pushing volume and stuff like that, then I think you have to be a little bit more careful about training to failure. So, in my opinion, I think it's best to kind of train on average to about 2 reps in reserve for most people training like 5 to 6 days a week and doing plenty of volume. But I would say generally, kind of saving your training to failure towards the ends of your workouts, the kind of final sets of a certain muscle group in those workouts is probably a good approach to kind of maximize that stimulus, but not to generate like needless fatigue. Yes, you're going to generate some fatigue to grow muscle, but it doesn't need to be needless fatigue, as I think that will just result in worse results overall. 3 podcasts ago, I had on Derek Van Every, and he had a recent study on weighted stretching. And one thing that we talked about was that weighted stretching might be an independent contributor that seems to kind of help muscle growth. And there's also not much kind of downside to experimenting with it. So, for example, let's say that you're doing, 4 sets for your calves. And after that 4th set, there's probably not much downside to like just sitting in the fully stretched position for your calves to where your kind of heels are fully as far as they'll go kind of below your toes to fully stretch your calves there under some load. There's probably not much downside to that. And it might also help with some muscle growth. So I think playing around with some weighted stretching, it might be a bit of a novel stimulus and it could potentially help. Now, make sure you do this with appropriate exercises. Like I think calf raises are one of those exercises to where there's very kind of little downside to just holding a weighted stretch for, 10 to 20 seconds following a set. But on something like a barbell squat, there's probably more downside to doing that. So I would say, this is something that's worth a try. It might be something to just incorporate for some variation's sake. I wouldn't base your entire training program around it, but I think that, maybe for a handful of muscle groups or a handful of muscle groups that you're particularly focused on, incorporating some sort of weighted stretching might be kind of worth it in those circumstances. 4 podcasts ago, I had on Dr. Sandro Bartolome. He definitely told me how to pronounce his name, and I have since forgotten, but we talked about periodization for muscle growth. And in his study, it suggested that doing mixed sessions, so sessions in which you do like lower rep training, moderate rep training, and higher rep training kind of all in one, led to improved muscle growth compared to more of a block periodization strategy in which you do like a classical strength block in which you do lower volumes, higher intensities. And when I say intensity, I mean like basically working in lower rep ranges on average. You do a block of that, and then you follow that up with a bit more volume, a bit more kind of higher rep ranges and stuff like that for hypertrophy. And his study found that a kind of mixed session approach was a bit better. And, you know, I kind of asked him this question, and he kind of speculated this was probably the case, in which muscle growth, it just takes a long time. So in a study to kind of actually accrue enough muscle growth to suggest a favorable response, you need more than just like a 4-week block to do it. So, you know, there's a chance that incorporating strength blocks over the course of an entire macro cycle could be helpful. But over the course of a 12-week mesocycle, if you want to see the best muscle growth, you should probably incorporate hypertrophy oriented training in all of those mesocycles across that 12 weeks. 5 podcasts ago, I had on Dr. Julio Camargo, and we talked about beta alanine. And the TLDR of this one was that it doesn't seem to be effective in kind of the short term. I think he did an 8-week study on beta alanine, and it didn't seem effective for kind of more muscle growth or performance. But I kind of did ask him, you know, would you speculate that since this does kind of make sense to mechanistically work as like an acid buffer that would help in more metabolic style training, do you think that it could potentially still help in if you were doing more kind of, you know, high reps, metabolite work, like drop sets, giant sets, stuff like that? And he kind of speculated that it would kind of make sense, but we don't really have the evidence for that at this point. So I would say with beta alanine, right now, we don't really know if it is more or less favorable for muscle growth, but I would say mechanistically speaking, it might make sense for those kind of metabolic style training. And like, I would say apart from the financial cost of it, there's probably not much physiological downsides to playing around with beta alanine. 6 podcasts ago, I had on Dr. Jose Antonio. So for this one, creatine monohydrate is probably the best form of creatine. It doesn't seem to cause damage to the kidneys. It doesn't probably cause hair loss. You probably don't need to load creatine, but you can do like a loading phase if you want to just get a bit saturated sooner. So you can do it, but you don't need to still experience the benefits over the long run. And then also, if you miss like a few days of taking your creatine, you don't need to then go through like this crazy loading period. Like creatine takes a long time to get out of your system. So if you miss a few days, you're still going to be mostly saturated with creatine, and you can just get back into taking it once again. 7 podcasts ago, I had on Ben Inglis, and we talked about partial range of motion training. And kind of the takeaway here was that partial range of motion training, so just doing kind of the lengthened position of an exercise, so like for a bicep curl, instead of kind of coming all the way up to contract, I'm kind of staying in that more lengthened range of motion at the bottom of the exercise. So like just coming up halfway, fully stretching the bicep, halfway, fully stretching the bicep. That might be as good, if not better, compared to just full range of motion training. So it's probably not the worst idea throughout your training programs to maybe incorporate some partial lengthened range of motion training where appropriate. So one kind of nice practical takeaway from this episode was that if there are muscle groups that you're particularly focused on, maybe in isolation exercises for those muscle groups, for the final set of those muscle groups in your workouts, you just kind of extend the set with some partial lengthened range of motion training. So let's say my chest is a particular area of focus. Well, maybe on my last set of pec decks that I'm doing for my chest, maybe I get to the end of my set and then I do an additional like 5 or 6 reps of just kind of the very stretched position of the pec deck and kind of just coming like halfway up, not fully contracting, but just like kind of half reps in that lengthened position. I think that would be a nice kind of practical takeaway for this. Now, I don't think you need to do like partials for every single muscle group and stuff like that to completely maximize things, but I would say for muscles that are a particular area of interest for you, there's little downside to doing something like I just mentioned. 8 podcasts ago, I had on Madeline Seidler, and she's a PhD candidate that just finished up a study on diet breaks. And it seems as though diet breaks, in her study at least, were not favorable for fat loss or improved metabolic rate. However, they did seem to maybe make the fat loss phase feel a bit less restraining. So kind of the practical takeaway here is like, physiologically speaking, it doesn't seem that diet breaks are like some sort of magic bullet, and you shouldn't expect them to be one. However, incorporating diet breaks every once in a while, they might make the fat loss phase feel a little bit less restraining, which may improve adherence over the long run. And I would say this can be a little bit hit and miss, in which some individuals, they have a diet break and then they experience more hunger after the diet break, and just having these swings in their calories are far worse for those individuals. So I do think this is going to be kind of individual to individual, but like generally speaking, I think incorporating diet breaks here and there for a lot of my clients, as well as the literature, it can make the diet phase feel a little bit less restraining. Just be careful about, if you find yourself not liking those swings in your calories and that makes you want to overeat more, just be cognizant of that. It can happen. But diet breaks aren't going to be like some magic physiological bullet that are going to allow you to kind of like preserve your metabolic rate and improve fat loss and stuff like that while you're dieting. 9 podcasts ago, I had on Irfan Bergenstein, and we talked all about caffeine. And in particular, he did a study in which it looked at, does someone's training status influence the beneficial effects of caffeine? So like if you're more trained, does caffeine help you more or less? And he basically found like no effect. So it doesn't seem as though caffeine and training status are really kind of impacted by one another. So if you're more trained or less trained, caffeine is probably still going to have beneficial effects. 10 podcasts ago, I had on Dr. Peter Fitchen. We just kind of discussed mistakes that people tend to make. And one thing that we talked about was that more volume, it's better, but only to a point. And I like to kind of shorten this into more recoverable volume is better. But that key point there is recoverable volume. And if you can't recover from your training, you're not going to adapt, as recovery is required for adaptation to occur. So you want to do kind of plenty of training, but not too much in which you can't recover from it, but it should be enough to actually drive adaptations to occur. So if you find yourself in situations in which you're having a lot of overlapping fatigue and soreness from session to session, I would say you're probably doing a bit too much and you might have trouble kind of actually recovering and adapting. But if you find yourself not making much progress and you're also not feeling like really any following day fatigue or soreness or anything like that, then I would say there's a good chance you should probably do a bit more and you might benefit from doing so. 11 podcasts ago, I had on Avery Rosa, and Avery recently did a study on compound versus isolation exercises and basically found that multi-joint and single joint exercises are pretty similarly effective for increasing your muscle size. So this kind of goes to show that you don't necessarily need to just do compounds to experience really good muscle growth. And you can definitely drive muscle growth using isolation movements. And I think this is another one of those situations in which it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You should definitely have compound movements in your program. I think that just improves the efficiency of your workouts. And I still think that there's something to like just the overloading nature of certain compound movements that helps for muscle growth. But also, don't kind of skimp out on those isolation exercises. I think they can be a great way to drive some kind of directed stimulus and can definitely improve muscle growth. 12 podcasts ago, I had on Jordan Lips, and we discussed fat loss mistakes. And one thing that Jordan talked about in this podcast is that it's okay if you don't feel fully satisfied all the time while you're dieting. Like, I think a lot of people are just, and myself as well. I know in previous diets, I would always want to try to kind of just avoid hunger and to, at all costs, just try not to be hungry. And I think this resulted in me just eating like way too much food volume, in which I was just kind of like bloated all the time. And I kind of got myself used to eating these huge voluminous meals. And I think it generally kind of hurt my relationship with food a little bit. And I think a better approach is just like accepting that inherently with a fat loss phase, you're going to have to eat in an energy deficit. There's no way around it. And when eating in an energy deficit, there's probably going to be some dissatisfaction that comes with finishing a meal in which you still kind of feel a little hungry. Or that kind of throughout the day, you get a little bit more experiences of hunger. And that's okay. I tried to reframe this in my head as hunger is just a signal that I'm in an energy deficit and I'm losing body fat. I'm getting closer to my goals. Now, you don't need to get like masochistic with this, in which you like do everything you can to be hungry, but just know that a little bit of hunger here and there, that's absolutely okay. It's not necessarily something to be avoided in a fat loss phase. So those are 12 takeaways from my last 12 podcasts. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know if you did, and I can do these like maybe after every 10 to 15 podcasts if you did actually like this. But yeah, share this on your story if you found it beneficial, and I'll catch you in that next one.